Well, this has to be the most Malaise of Malaise era cars that I have ever seen. And thanks to my viewer Luke for sending me an email about this one, because I definitely would have spotted it. And it is awesome. This is one of those cars that I have really no desire to own, but I certainly have a desire to drive it. I just want to know what this thing drives like, because this is a 1979 Oldsmobile Cutlass Calais with a 4.3 liter V8 diesel. And it also has a 5-speed overdrive manual transmission. What an awesome combination. I don't know what the person who ordered this was thinking, but they ordered basically a loaded up Cutlass Supreme that you can see has T-tops and power windows, power locks, air conditioning, AM FM radio, the diesel engine, soft ray glass, front floor mats, rear floor mats. It's got a ton of different options. It even has the deluxe luggage trim with the spare tire cover, but we're going to see in a second that the trunk trim is really not very deluxe at all. In fact, I would say it's quite crude. And that's kind of my overall feeling on these Cutlasses that were reintroduced for the 1978 model year. I just don't feel them all that much, if you know what I mean. I think that the 1973 to 1977 generation Cutlass, the one that really put the Cutlass on the map in terms of being the volume car for Oldsmobile, were generally stellar cars. They rode great, they drove great, they were reliable. And the only thing that was really weak about them were the door hinge pins, which was true for every single GM car of the era. But other than that, the 73 to 77 Cutlass was a pretty sweet vehicle. And the generation before that ended in 1972 was also pretty awesome and looked great as well. So when this new generation came out for the 1978 model year, I have to say I have a pretty tepid feeling about them. I don't think that the styling is quite right compared to the previous generations, especially the beautiful Cutlasses of the last few years of the prior generation that had that waterfall grille. It just doesn't get better than that. Now, in 1979, there were many different flavors of the Cutlass. The Calais was really the sporty variant, and it was named after the town of Calais, France. And when you got the Calais, you got a little bit different texture grille. You got bucket seats that we're going to see in a moment. You got a sports steering wheel. So it was meant to be a car with a bit of a sporty flair as opposed to the Cutlass Supreme, which looked very, very similar, but was more of the luxury variant. So the Calais was the sport variant, and I'm sure that all of you who recollect the 1985 Oldsmobile Calais would certainly say that that N-body car was a very sporty vehicle indeed. So I'm just kidding, obviously. Oldsmobile, on this particular model year, though, did use it for a more sporty variant than its normal Cutlass. But you can kind of see where, for me, this particular vehicle went a little wrong. And up front, you only have the single headlamps on either side, 2 lamps in total versus the quad headlamps from before, presumably for cost savings, I think. And that's really the theme of this car, is a cost cut of the previous generation vehicle. You don't have that waterfall grille anymore, which was beautiful. You do have this interesting rectangle-like texture grille. And if you look at the body sides, there's really not much sculpture to them. Of course, this was the sheer look era from General Motors. It doesn't look bad, but also just kind of looks inoffensive. Now, as we rotate around to the side of the vehicle, you're also going to see one of the problems with this vehicle, and that's the front and rear overhangs. Something about this car just doesn't quite look right. I don't mind a car with large front and rear overhangs. In fact, that was a trait for many Fords, like the Lincoln Mark V. Huge front and rear overhangs. And I don't think that car looks bad, but something about this just doesn't look quite right. It has a very glassy upper. You have that belt line that's kind of subtly dipping down. Notice that as it's dipping down as it goes toward the rear quarter glass. And then you have the belt line sweep upward, and the deck lid is relatively elevated as well. Something, again, just to my eye, doesn't look quite right with this car in the side view. I think the side view is probably the least favorite view from my particular perspective. But hey, what do I know? It does look like this car is missing a piece of that rocker molding trim right behind the front wheel. Well, these things weren't stuck on all that well back in the era. Like I said, these cars weren't made all that well. And, well, this is the result. You also have that half toupee look, that half vinyl top. That was never my favorite on any car. If you're going to go vinyl top, you need the full vinyl top, or you need no vinyl top. Not this kind of half toupee look that looks like it's sliding down the back of the roof toward the rear of the vehicle. Of course, you couldn't have a full vinyl top because this car has T-tops, which you can see are off in this particular photo. And that definitely makes it cool, as do the wheels. The optional wheels are pretty good looking as well. And as we rotate out back, you have the kind of signature vertical tail lamps for the Cutlass. That was something that was not just a Cadillac trait, but Oldsmobile did. And they often bisected the tail lamps like you see here, or split them into two, just as a Cutlass trait. That was true for a number of Cutlasses over the years. And you can see that the quarter has this little kick up around the rear quarter glass, that little feature line that starts and helps form the top of the quarter panel as it goes backward. But, again, overall, kind of a milk toast, let's say, styled car. Not anything that's overly offensive or dynamic. And certainly it has that very characteristic trait of the era, the vertical C-pillar that GM had on many, many cars. And that would continue as a styling trait onto the front-wheel drive variants into the 1980s before GM styling really kind of got knocked back on their heels by the Fortune magazine cover in 1983 and the 1986 Ford Taurus. That really scared them into going into a different direction with the styling other than what you see here. Now let's take a look at the interior, because this is kind of cool. As I mentioned, on the Calais, you had these bucket seats that were standard and that sport steering wheel. I love the metal spokes. It's kind of like a 4-spoke that's collapsed into a 2-spoke steering wheel with a Pentastar-like horn pad, I guess I want to say. But you notice the car has, as I mentioned, power locks, power windows, rear defogger, air conditioning, 5-speed overdrive manual, power seats. This is a pretty loaded car. And despite the fact that it was loaded and expensive, you notice some kind of unfortunate trim pieces, the very hard plastic lower portion of the dash, the exposed screws on the A-pillar. It just wasn't quite in keeping with the overall, let's say, expense of the vehicle. This was not a cheap car back in its day. And the shifter boot, which we'll take a closer look at in a second, for the manual transmission, looks like it's just laying over top of a big cutout in the floor pan, which it is, but it almost looks like it's an aftermarket job as opposed to factory. It doesn't appear to be well styled and integrated into the car. And here you can see what I mean. It just looks like it's this big, overly large rubber boot, not very attractive or stylized. But it does have the 5-speed manual, as I mentioned, and Oldsmobile advertised this as a 5-speed manual that had short throws. I don't think that it has overly short throws. Maybe it did relative to other cars of the era, like a pickup truck. But this 5-speed is backing a 4.3-liter V8 diesel that was available only for one model year. Many people know the Oldsmobile V8 diesel, the 5.7-liter, the 350 cubic inch diesel that lasted from 1978 to 1985, or the 4.3-liter V6 diesel. But the 4.3-liter V8 diesel was a 1979 only diesel, only offered in Oldsmobiles in that single model year. So this is a true unicorn. The fact that you have the diesel under hood that made all of 90 horsepower, and no, it didn't even have that much torque, 160 pound-feet of torque. So it's effectively a big 4-cylinder engine under hood in this car. And a 5-speed overdrive manual. I don't even know if you could climb a moderate grade hill in 5th gear if you were trying to go 70 miles an hour. But somebody here who ordered this car wanted the strangest combination of options and configurations for their vehicle. They wanted something that was a sporty car, hence the Calais, but highly efficient, the 4.3-liter V8 diesel with the 5-speed overdrive manual transmission. And before we go to the underhood area, just one last look at this interior. I think the theme isn't all that bad of the interior. I like the gauges in that pod on the top of the instrument panel. This did have a full complement of gauges. I would guess the red line on this diesel was 4,000 RPM. Unfortunately, there's not a close-up of the dash, so I can't really see that, but that had to be a special tachometer for this engine. And on top of that, you can see that you have the little pod for the radio and the HVAC. The only thing about this, the ergonomics on these weren't all that great. You'd find yourself reaching forward. The reach envelope was not all that well done. You'd have to reach forward to change the radio volume or the station, as well as the HVAC. It wasn't something that was set back enough for you to reach, especially if you were a taller driver. And here we are, the 4.3 liter V8 diesel. It really just looks like an Oldsmobile 350 diesel because all of the Oldsmobile small blocks employed the same stroke and the same deck height. So everything from the 260 gas engine or this 4.3 liter V8 diesel all the way up through the 403 cubic inch V8 engine, which was also a small block, employed the same stroke on Oldsmobile. So, of course, the 403 was way over square from a bore and stroke perspective. But you'll see this car has the pancake R4 style air conditioning compressor, has a huge silencer on the air cleaner. Remember, diesels have high compression ratios. I think these were 22.5 to 1 compression ratio. And so they're taking in quite a bit of air. There's no throttle plate on a diesel either. It just kind of ingests as much air as it wants. So you get quite a bit of intake rush noise if you don't have that silencer on there. But I can't even imagine activating the air conditioning on this car because you only had 90 horsepower to begin with, and that R4 compressor's got to take, 5-6 horsepower to run on its own. So now you're down to 85 net horsepower in a pretty large car. It's just humorous, but I love this car. Like I said, I want to drive it. Interestingly, this car was ordered originally in California, and the owner ordered it with an engine block heater. I have no idea why, other than maybe they just checked every single option box because this car has a ton of options on it. And, well, maybe they went north or something like that in the winter, so you had to have that particular option. And lastly, we'll take a look at the trunk here. And normally I don't highlight the trunks, but I thought this was interesting because this car does have the optional luxurious trunk trim. And this doesn't look very luxurious to me. You got the cardboard inserts, the exposed gooseneck hinges. You did get a spare tire cover. That was actually not standard, amazingly. And you kind of got this cheap material that lined the trunk as opposed to just a mat. But, again, this was kind of, for me, the low point for some of the GM vehicles. They just didn't quite have the cost in them that the previous generation did. The interior that you saw was a pretty nice interior, aside from some hard plastics, but you did have nice bucket seats. But GM did start cheaping out in a number of areas on these, and even the sheet metal quality and the thickness of it was quite thin compared to the previous generation cars in an attempt to save weight and money. The other thing that you got in these was you didn't have a great transmission in general. Here you had the 5-speed manual, but you had a lighter transmission, a Turbo Hydromatic 200, backing many of the engines in this Cutlass, which was not a great transmission. It was just employed because it was light. It actually started out life as a Chevrolet Vega transmission, believe it or not. So there you have it. Like I said, this has to be the most Malaise-era vehicle that I have ever seen in my entire life. It has to be a total unicorn. I can't imagine hardly any of these were produced. The Calais was actually a pretty rare car to begin with relative to the Cutlass Supreme. Then you add on top of that the fact that this one has T-tops and the diesel and a 5-speed manual transmission. This is about as unicorn as it's going to get, period. So if you want it, this one's actually on Facebook Marketplace in California. I recommend that you take a look and, maybe procure it, because if you really, really have an inkling for this car, you're not going to be able to scratch that itch with any future vehicle. I'll just caution you that these cars are not that well built, and it's a challenge in some cases to even repair them. Like if the heater core goes out, that is a lot tougher job, I would say, on this car than the previous generation. And even then, it wasn't all that easy, but it was doable. This generation made it even harder. So put a comment in the comment section. What do you think? Thanks again for watching.